Good morning, dear friends. My name is Igor Kovenko. It is now 7:44 in Kiev. Today is February 27th, and we continue our daily morning reflections on what is happening in Russia, in the world, in Ukraine, and in our souls. A little bit about, let's talk for a moment about the various holidays and commemorative days, since they can actually serve as very significant indicators of what the culture of a country is truly like. Today in Russia, they are celebrating Special Operations Day. Well, it's a sort of professional holiday for the occupiers. And what about the rest of the world? In the world, today there are two international holidays. These are International Non-Governmental Organizations Day and International Polar Bear Day, both of which are observed globally. The polar bear, of course, is a truly predatory animal. It is large, strikingly beautiful, and extremely dangerous to humans. But nevertheless, here's how things stand. As for me personally, if I absolutely had to choose between the polar bear and the Special Operations Forces, my sympathies are truly with the wonderful, wonderful polar bear. In general, this kind of situation, I would say that a festive analysis, in my opinion, can tell you a lot about a country. And so when in Russia it's the day of Special Operations Forces, while in the rest of the world it's International Non-Governmental Organizations Day and International Polar Bear Day. I think this really highlights the anthropological chasm that distinctly separates Russia from the vast majority of the rest of humanity. And also on this day, February 27, 2015, just steps away from the Kremlin walls, the prominent opposition leader was tragically assassinated, Boris Nemtsov. I honestly don't know, but for some people there is a significant question. What exactly does the Kremlin have to do with this situation at all? I really don't know if there are people who truly think that just a mere stone's throw away from the Kremlin walls, someone could actually commit a murder and then slip away completely unnoticed by the authorities. I don't know. It seems to me that these people have either never been to Russia or they're just being disingenuous. It's about the same as saying that Navalny also died simply of natural causes, or that Putin has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that people are dying in Ukraine right now. Well, of course, as everyone knows, Nemtsov was without any doubt murdered, most likely on Putin's direct orders, or was it sanctioned? This murder happened, so it's part of the same pattern. These are the kinds of historical, festive, and not so festive rhymes. Let's now move on to today's events. Under the influence, there are threats that are coming from many different sides, from the east, from the west, and again from the east. The Russian threat from the east and from the west across the vast Atlantic Ocean to Europe. Trump is putting on the pressure. So, under the influence of these two supporters of different kinds of fascism, Europe is focusing its attention. And this concentration today, I would like to focus on some small northern countries. Iceland. It seems that Iceland is preparing on whether or not to join the European Union. The Prime Minister of Iceland has officially announced that this year there will be a national referendum in which the citizens of Iceland will decide their future, will express their attitude toward European integration. So the primary underlying motivation is really this: geopolitical changes. In short, it all comes down to one word: Trump. That is, and this is quite clear and absolutely obvious, That's precisely how the situation is, because when the Prime Minister of Iceland announced this important referendum, it was stated very clearly and directly that this is indeed a referendum. To counter any potential threats, joining the European Union is necessary. So Iceland is incredibly and remarkably unique, progressive, extremely developed, and an extremely free country. According to the Human Development Index, which measures overall well-being, it is ranked among the top 5 countries. And by the Global Peace Index, yes, that is a real and respected index, it actually ranks first in the world. But Iceland is located quite close to Greenland, and so I completely understand that this whole Greenland adventure of Trump's, well, it generally causes a fair amount of bewilderment. But I think that the descendants of the Vikings, with their long and proud history of resilience, are more than capable of resisting anyone. The Icelanders are an amazing people. I think that no Trump will be able to handle them, just as with the Greenlanders. Another country that is now, quite clearly, increasingly concerned about potential threats, this time threats coming from the east, is Ireland. For the first time in its history, Ireland is now considering a maritime security strategy and is planning to expand its cooperation with NATO countries to strengthen its regional defense. Ireland is not a member of NATO. Well, according to the tradition, so to speak, of being a non-aligned country, independent, not joining any blocs, this has always been our approach. But nevertheless, such voices are already being heard in Ireland. Neutrality is neutrality, but the obvious danger, including that which is coming from the east, is really making people think. There is also growing concern about the significant threat to undersea communication cables and gas pipelines on which life on the island truly depends. Plus, additionally, the appearance of drones in the sky just after on the day of Volodymyr Zelensky's visit. Russian drones appeared in the sky over Iceland. That is, that's why the first national maritime security strategy in the history of Iceland, actually in the history of Ireland, was introduced for the very first time. And here it is stated directly that the reason is the threats posed by the so-called shadow fleet of Russia. In other words, and the problem here is that this shadow tanker fleet is used not only for transporting Russian oil, but also for operations involving intelligence services. That is, a whole series of incidents that occurred in the Baltic Sea are connected to the Russian fleet. Well, in other words, actually, you see, Ireland is yet another nation that is steadily and visibly moving toward European integration, and is trying in some way to counter the potential threat posed by Russia. Denmark is another small northern European country that is deeply and visibly concerned about these threats, this time threats from the other side. From across the Atlantic, we're talking about threats from Trump. Well, it's clear here. Trump's recent hysteria with his attempt and his sudden attempt to seize Greenland caused great concern and significant unease throughout the nation of Denmark. And in this regard, Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen officially announced that new parliamentary elections would be held in Denmark on March 24th. These are critical parliamentary elections that have been called at least 6 months ahead of the original schedule, primarily because the current political situation requires a fresh mandate from the people. As the Prime Minister herself said, in the coming years we must stand firmly and confidently on our own 2 feet. We also need to clearly define the true nature of our relationships. with the United States of America, and we need to rearm so that there is lasting peace and stability on our continent. So, obviously, the main motivation here is that these upcoming elections are, in fact, an attempt to reconsider and possibly redefine relations with the United States of America. That is, to address the perceived threat coming from the West. So, Europe really, including not only the larger nations, but also the smaller countries, those that have always maintained a consistent position of neutrality. Well, in fact, the example of Finland is actually very telling in this particular context. Finland and Sweden, which have always maintained, especially Finland, a position of neutrality, have actually decided to abandon neutrality for the sake of security. In other words, there is a clear consolidation taking place in Europe. Another significant and transformative process that is becoming very apparent in our world today is a kind of deep purification, which is reshaping how we see things, primarily of Western civilization, from all kinds of rot. And perhaps unexpectedly, the Epstein files have now become a significant factor in this ongoing process of purification. A kind of Epstein epidemic is now happening across the world, specifically in the United States of America and throughout Europe, because as a direct result of the public release of these files, a whole number of prominent people are simply resigning or are being held strictly accountable. I'll list them briefly. Some of them, at least, high ranking politicians who have already suffered as a result of the Epstein epidemic. So I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, so I'll read from my notes. So, Klaus Schwab, the longtime head of the World Economic Forum, has literally just resigned from his post just yesterday. Meanwhile, Prince Andrew remains one of the most famous and controversial victims of the Epstein scandal. He was recently stripped of his official royal titles and public duties and has been subjected to significant scrutiny. A 12-hour interrogation as part of the investigation. Larry Summers, former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Torbjörn Jagland, the former Prime Minister of Norway, who, after the publication of the sensitive data in a very difficult period of his life, attempted suicide. Gerd Salaretz, the former Secretary General of the Council of Europe. For him, the Council of Europe specifically lifted his diplomatic immunity to allow investigative actions. Gina Raimondo, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, who publicly admitted to visiting Epstein's island and, so to speak, is awaiting investigation. Then, just recently, the president and CEO of the World Economic Davos Forum, Børge Brende, who has led the organization for quite some time, officially announced his decision to step down and resign from his current position. Well, in general, it's clear what the reason is, although he did not specify it in his official resignation statement. Epstein, nevertheless, so to speak, it's obvious that the reason is the investigative connection here. It's pretty obvious. It's actually very telling that a huge number of thousands, there are, so to speak, two entities, I would put it that way, for whom, as they say, it's like water off a duck's back. On the one hand, there's Trump, who is mentioned tens of thousands of times in Epstein's files, but absolutely, he feels perfectly fine. And then there's Hillary Clinton, who was summoned to testify. She said, well, invite Trump. Why are you wasting your time on nonsense? After all, he's Epstein's main friend, who is mentioned tens of thousands of times in his files. There is also clear and concrete evidence of the rape of a 13-year-old girl, which is a truly disturbing fact. Well, Trump, on the other hand, feels perfectly fine about it, and he has absolutely no intention of reflecting on or even thinking about any of that. What Epstein No, there's no Epstein at all. He's been dead for a long time now, and that's just the way it is. Russia's position is even more cynical. In Russia, there hasn't been a single consequence, even though a huge number of people are involved there. In particular, it's obvious that the torrential flow of honey traps from Russia, which were organized by all sorts of agencies, including the famous Krasnodar modeling agency. All of this clearly is the handiwork of the FSB, and obviously, without some kind of sanction from Putin, such an industry in collaboration with Epstein would have been impossible. But nevertheless, there is no reflection, no problem, only schadenfreude and smugness. This is what is particularly concerning about this epidemic, the Epstein epidemic, a very characteristic event as well, which is currently unfolding across the globe at this very moment and is leaving a lasting mark on the biographies of people in Europe and the entire United States of America, except for Trump and Russia, for whom the problem. The institution of reputation does not properly function due to the absence of such a thing. Another important process, as it seems to me, was identified by the Wall Street Journal, which published an article stating that for the first time since the Great Depression, in fact, for the first time in 100 years, more people have left the United States of America than have arrived. In other words, the country of immigrants is turning into a country of emigrants. That is to say, emigration has now actually surpassed immigration for the first time. Well, Trump, of course, praises himself, saying that this is the result of tough migration policies. Nothing of the sort. The main point here is that not only are migrants leaving the country in large numbers, but citizens of the United States of America are also departing as well. Practically, the number of Americans who are now choosing to come and live, as well as work, in all of the various European countries has recently reached record levels. That is to say, American communities, the American diaspora already numbers in the tens of millions. In major cities like Lisbon and Dublin, not just in Europe, but also in various vibrant cities throughout Colombia, Thailand, and the island of Bali. You can find growing communities of Americans. So, in reality, Americans are increasingly fleeing the country. Unfortunately, when I was preparing for our conversation, I noticed that this very publication in the Ostrov Journal does not specify it. A detailed analysis of the reasons. I tried to find studies on this topic. Surely they exist, but unfortunately, in the time I had to prepare for our conversation, I wasn't able to find any research on the motives. But it's absolutely obvious. This is one of those cases where I don't believe in coincidences. The fact that all this is happening under Trump's administration, it is becoming increasingly clear that Trump's policies are having a significant impact on this. In other words, the American way of life is no longer the most attractive. That is, America is no longer that shining city on a hill that draws people from all over the world. Yes, it still attracts people from other countries, primarily from Latin America and probably from some other countries where the standard of living is much lower. But Americans themselves are also trying to leave the country. At least many of them are. So that is the complete story. And to bring a conclusion to the first part of our conversation, I want to take a moment to share two personal stories. One story is deeply connected with the life of a former, well, actually, why say former? Anatoly Chubais. He's not former anything. He's just Anatoly Chubais. To be perfectly honest, here I wanted to talk about Coke's record breaking marathon length interview with Dud. I am still waiting for the long awaited day when Dud will finally get around to interviewing Chubais. It's interesting, really. After all, it's Dud we're talking about, even though lately there have been a lot of questions about him because of his recent transformation to some extent. But still, Dud certainly knows exactly how to handle it. He knows how to expose characters like the Tin Can, and with Coke, he managed to do a remarkably impressive job. I think that with Chubais, it could potentially turn out even more brilliantly as well. I'm still waiting. But anyway, that's not the point. That's just my personal impression. Here's the essence of the matter. Anatoly Chubais is trying to challenge the sanctions that have been imposed on him by Canada. So his motivation is as follows. He claims that he has always been firmly and consistently in opposition to the president of Russia. And in his official biography, which he personally sent to the Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Chubais wrote that, historically speaking, he has always been in opposition to the president of Russia. Historically. It's interesting, though, at what specific point exactly was he actually in opposition to the president? No, he really wasn't, not at all. Well, it's clear that after the major invasion, Chubais is a rather quick-witted person. He realized where everything was heading and understood that, as they say, it was time to get out, so he left. But before that, it was Anatoly Borisovich Chubais who played an important part in making sure that, well, Chubais' role in Putin's rise is absolutely, unmistakably obvious. Chubais' role in the successor operation is also quite clear. Chubais' role in the politics of the Union of Right Forces, when Chubais participated in that campaign, well, if not personally, then at least he was certainly one of the most influential leaders of the Union of Right Forces at the time when that party was running for the State Duma under the slogans Putin for president, Kirienko for the Duma. So, in what way did Chubais' opposition manifest itself when he was working hand in hand with Putin at the RAO-UES? How did his opposition to Putin show when he was working hand in hand with Putin? When he worked at the company Rusnano? Well, it's a strange story, isn't it? A so-called historical opposition figure. By the way, that's actually a good term. We should adopt it. A very curious character, Anatoly Borisovich Chubais. I think this is a figure who truly deserves recognition, honestly. This warrants a completely separate discussion. A man who was intimately involved in the initial formation and the subsequent crystallization of the Russian fascist regime. Undoubtedly, he is one of the primary financial backers. That is to say, he is a person who undoubtedly invested an immense amount of personal effort into ensuring that the fascist nebula within Russia solidified, thickened, and crystallized. But now, quite remarkably, he claims that he is a long-standing figure of the historical opposition. Here's another personal story to share with you, although this one is of a somewhat smaller scale compared to others I have mentioned. This is in connection with the anniversary. Well, I'm not really, when we talked about historical rhymes, I didn't really want to focus on a major specific historical rhyme. This was the anniversary of the 20th Congress of the CPCU, at which the cult of personality that had developed around Stalin was officially denounced. So, on this particular occasion, some important hearings were held in Russia, and the head of the Human Rights Council also spoke at them. Under Vladimir Putin, the official Valery Fadiv made a truly stunning statement. He suggested publicly exposing Sergei Davletov's phrase about 4 million denunciations. Here is exactly what he said back then, and it really needs to be quoted right now. I will read his words aloud. This is indeed his very own direct quote. Indeed, 4 million denunciations were written, and if there were so many denunciations, who was it that wrote them? Valery Fadiv poses the question: was it millions of citizens or specially trained informers, or were they forced by the NKVD? This phrase is widely used and everyone relies on it. If it's not true, let's expose it, because it's a very powerful political phrase. So you see, it's like a human rights defender serving under a cannibal, and that's exactly what Fadiv's position looks like. The chief human rights defender under Putin, consistently defending human rights. Whose rights is he actually defending? So, of course, he is certainly moving along the right path. First, we need to expose the works of Dovlatov, then Khrushchev with his famous secret report, which, by the way, in this very speech, he also calls largely mistaken. So, specifically, what were those mistakes? In what specific way did these occur? Then, of course, we need to bring Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov into the open as well. And by no means should we forget to expose Sakharov. And when the whole company of slanderers of Russia, apparently starting with Chadayev, are exposed, then in this sterilized proper history of Russia, only the brilliant ones will remain. The generalissimo of victory, the renowned and celebrated leader Stalin, and the continuer of his brilliant legacy, victorious march, Vladimir Putin, the unifier of Russian lands. Well, that's about it. You know, I really started to wonder, take Fadiv, for example. When he tries to look at himself in the mirror after all this, does he even see his own reflection? And does he still cast a shadow? By the way, the same goes for Anatoly Borisovich Chubais. By the way, I definitely know that he lives in Israel, and I'm quite sure that people often run into him on the streets there. I wonder, for those who've seen Chubais in person, does he still cast a shadow or not anymore? That is precisely the important point I wanted to draw your attention to and emphasize for you today, my dear friends, in our discussion.